Good morning, everyone, and you're welcome to the Ladder Back Down session on the C-Risk professional in the workplace. I'd like to thank you all for taking the time out to share your Saturday with me. And I'd also like to say thank you to everyone who's written in the chat window, thanking me for sharing my knowledge. Just one thing on that point, it's not anything noble to share one's knowledge, rather it's the right thing to do, because I believe that knowledge shared is not knowledge halved, like a problem is, rather it's knowledge doubled, because I always tend to gain a lot from chats and questions and discussions that take place during my workshops. So please continue to contribute today to the discussions around risk and the C-Risk professional in the workplace. Why the ladder back down? In 2004, I addressed some students that were going off to university. And I asked them the question, who says you can't? And I responded to that question myself. I said that no one can tell you that you cannot do something. No one can tell you that you cannot achieve anything unless you say the same to yourself. No one can tell you that you can't have an impact on society, on others, on your family, on your children, on your colleagues, in the workplace, in your community, unless you say you can't. So if there's anyone here who believes that because you don't come from a background where you've gained access to a degree, for example, please don't tell yourself that you can't become a risk professional. If anyone believes that you can't afford certification, and this means that you cannot become a risk professional and enjoy a successful career, please stop telling yourself that, because you can. The only person that can stop you from achieving your goals is you. The Ladder Back Down was created, established, founded in January 2020. The aim of the Ladder Back Down is to try and motivate and inspire humans from my background, Black human beings, to look behind us to where we're coming from and to try and bring others up to where we are or even beyond. It costs us nothing to motivate others, to mentor others, to become successful in their chosen career path. And that is what the Ladder Back Down is about. So thank you to everyone who's attending today. I note there are delegates from the US, there are delegates from Africa, there are delegates from the UK. And it's a privilege to take you through this workshop. And I really hope that each and every one of you gains something and that you're able to use the knowledge that you gain to become successful in industry, in your chosen career paths. We'll be taking a look at some risk definitions and discussions. We'll also be going through how to identify risk. Then we'll be conducting a risk assessment, risk monitoring, and risk reporting will also be included in our discussions. What is risk? One of the definitions of risk is it's a vulnerability that could be exploited by a threat. Don't worry about the definition of vulnerability or threats. We will be taking a look at that later. Another definition by IEC 73 is the probability of an event materializing and its consequences. Risk is often seen as an adverse event. And many a time when I talk to individuals about considering a risk career, they often say, no, that's too risky. But life is risky. From the moment we're born, we manage risk. When we start walking, we see obstacles along our way and we navigate around those obstacles. So we are risk managers from the time of birth. This is often seen as an adverse event, as I was saying there, but there could also be an opportunity in the risk that we identify. Can anyone think of such an opportunity? Responses in the chat window, please. Thank you. Also, let me just elaborate on that. So a risk could be regarded as an opportunity because risks can be positive. We can take a risk in applying for a job, which results in a successful career. We can take a risk in starting a company with loans, with no guarantee of success. And that company then grows and thrives. The pandemic, whilst it was a terrible event across the world, still resulted in an opportunity for pharmaceutical companies to make a profit. A ransomware outbreak would result in an opportunity for anti-malware firms to make a profit. So whilst risk is often seen as an adverse event, there could be opportunities for some organizations to make a profit. Risk tends to impact information assets, and we will take a look at what an information asset is within an organization. And risk, as we've said previously, exploits vulnerabilities. If there is no vulnerability to be exploited, then there is no risk. And if there is no threat to exploit a vulnerability, again, there is no risk. Let's take a look at further risk definitions. An inherent risk is a risk that an activity would pose if there are no controls in place, or if there were no mitigating factors in place. What is an inherent risk to, for example, a petrol station? The inherent risk in starting a petrol business is the risk of fire. Before we put controls in place, such as health and safety training for staff, signs and notices at each pump for drivers to not smoke, for drivers to turn off their engine before filling up. Also fire buckets with sand. Those are all controls that are put into place in a petrol station to reduce the inherent risk of a fire. An inherent risk arises by nature of the business that is being carried out. In a hospital, unfortunately, there is the inherent risk of injured patients. There is the inherent risk of patients dying, because that is the nature of a hospital, to treat injured or sick humans. Residual risk is the risk that remains after controls have been implemented. For example, in the petrol station risk that I've just described, the inherent risk is a risk of fire. And I've mentioned some controls that could be put into place to reduce the risk or the impact or the probability of a fire. However, even after we've provided health and safety training to our petrol station attendants, we have put up notices for drivers to not smoke at the pump and to turn off their engines. We have also put sand buckets in place in the event of a fire. The fact still remains that there is a risk of a fire. A secondary risk is a risk that arises as a direct result of implementing a risk response. So we could implement controls. For example, in the workplace, we implement a new firewall to protect our network from malicious incoming traffic. That firewall could be configured inadvertently by IT and end up blocking all traffic into the network. So that is the secondary risk, because we have implemented the control of a firewall, and as a result of that, we have ended up blocking all traffic into our network. And until that is resolved, that is an issue for the organization. An asset is anything of value to the business which can affect business operations, and we'll talk about that again later. But intangible assets are assets that are not physical in nature and that we cannot place a financial value upon. Whereas tangible assets are assets in physical form, such as hardware, buildings. We can value buildings, we can value our hardware. We can't value our brand. We can't value our intellectual property, such as patents, trademarks, copyrights. We can't place a financial value on intangible assets. What are some causes of risk? changes in economic conditions, financial conditions, changes in political climates, changes in financial markets. New competition could give rise to risk. A new competitor in the markets that we operate in as a company could give rise to competition and risk. New legislation where our company is mandated to adopt such rules and regulations that could give rise to risk. If we don't have the knowledge, the finances, the skills, or other resources to implement the new legislation, that could be a risk to the business. Natural disasters, as we know, pandemics, sicknesses could give rise to risk. Legacy equipment, where we're using outdated equipment that is no longer supported by the vendor or the manufacturer of that equipment or software. That could give rise to a risk against our organizations. Strained employee relations, where the organization has a toxic culture and employees are disgruntled. That could give rise to risk. And we'll talk about that later. I've seen the question, what happens if you work in an organization where they don't take risk seriously? Well, I would advise each and every one of us here that if that's the case, you choose to stay and try to do your job given 100%, or you can leave. If you're not in a position to change things materially, then find another job and leave. But risk management and risk professionals are not there to enforce our views and our skills on an organization. We're there to advise about risk. We're there to identify the risk, assess the risks, and then provide the information that we've gathered on each risk to stakeholders who are able to reach informed decisions about each risk that has been presented to them. What is the goal of risk management? That is to reduce the risk to our information assets to an acceptable level. The goal is not to eliminate risk, rather to reduce the risk to our information assets to an acceptable level, not to eliminate risk. We cannot eliminate risk because if we consider the example of the fire at a petrol station, the risk of a fire at a petrol station, I stated that the inherent risk is the risk of a fire. However, there will always remain residual risk. The only way that we can avoid or eliminate risk is to close the petrol station. To withdraw from the business. of selling petrol. So the goal of risk management is to reduce the risk to our information assets to an acceptable level. How do we manage risk? We first identify the risks, we assess the risk, we select the risk treatment. So we would be proposing different treatment options to the risk owner. And then the risk owner would select their preferred treatment options based on multiple considerations, which we'll be discussing later. After the risk treatment has been selected, then there becomes a need for the implementation of the risk treatment. So if the risk treatment selected at a fire station, for example, is to send all petrol attendants to a health and safety course, to also put notices up for drivers, then someone has to actually do those things and make sure that they happen. Someone has to arrange health and safety training for the petrol attendants and make sure that they attend that training. As part of risk management, we then have to monitor risk continually. So risk management is not a one-off event. Rather, we monitor risk on an ongoing basis. And then we continue to report on the risks in the risk register. Why do we monitor risk on an ongoing basis? Because our risk posture, our risk landscape in our organizations will continue to change. Threats change, vulnerabilities change. In some cases, we will fix a vulnerability, and then another vulnerability may arise. Remember, we talked about secondary risk earlier. So we need to monitor our risk landscape on an ongoing basis. And then we report on those risks to the relevant stakeholders within our organization.